So, this weekend in Sacred Gathering, we are going to finish off the Gospel of Mark, and we will be talking about how it ends in kind of an unusual way. It leaves us hanging a little bit. But first, after last week, when we looked at the trial, the story continues. They take him in the morning to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. He knowingly gives injustice to Jesus, knowing full well that they're simply jealous of him, that he's not actually a political threat to him. Yet he also rejects him, whatever works, whatever is the easiest path. And then we have the scene of Jesus' crucifixion, in which, yes, publicly the leaders have denied Jesus, and then now the public, which was with him, many of whom were probably even at that triumphal entry, hoping he would be their Messiah, denies him, and then he is crucified. And then the story continues with Jesus' actual death, which we get in chapter 15. Starting in verse 33, it says, "And when the 6th hour, which is about noon, had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders, hearing it, said, Behold, he's calling Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, Wait, let's see if Elijah will come take him down. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he'd breathed his last, he said, Truly, this man was the Son of God. There were also women looking from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him, and there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem." So a couple of just important things about this story is the story of Jesus on the cross and his abandonment is a rending, a ripping of the Trinity itself. God, who is multiple people and one God, has been ripped in half, right? The Father is separated and judging the Son because he is becoming on our behalf. He is becoming sin and death and spiritual darkness, everything in the world that needs to be crucified with him, whereas those things will all die. He will, of course, be resurrected. But this moment is indescribably painful for God himself. God has experienced his very being ripped asunder in a way that he's never experienced up until this point, because he is always a fellowship, a dance, as some of the traditions say. And I think that there's something really important about this story and the crucifixion and God's willingness to be ripped in half himself, right? I think it's an important thing for just solidarity. God who has never been alone before, God who has never felt shame before because he's never done something wrong, God who has never felt lonely or abandoned, who has never lost a parent, who has never lost a child. All of those things, every pain, every darkness is encapsulated in this moment. And again, where our view of God tends to be one of power, right? God gets to do what he wants. He can speak the world into creation. This moment says something very important about God's heart and God's experience. God has experienced personally any darkness that we can see in the world. And God is not using his power but his own self to bring about the healing. This is the core of Christianity and how following Christ is different than any other religious system, any other spiritual system in the world, whereas almost every other system has something to do with climbing to something that is bigger and better, right? This is a system in which God comes down, takes pain and darkness and sin into himself, that sacrifices himself for the sake of something greater, for the sake of the greater healing and all of that. And so I just think it's important for us to take this moment seriously, how incredibly difficult this was for God, what this says about God, and again, the ultimate sense of solidarity that God shows with humanity and all forms of darkness in which to overcome that. There is no suffering in the world that God does not know and feel and has not experienced. All of that is encapsulated in this moment when Jesus knows complete abandonment, knows complete loneliness in his death. It is heartbreaking, and yet God's willingness to do this for our sake, for the sake of healing the world, is something that cannot but help and inspire awe, at least in me, and I think in almost anyone who understands what the claims Jesus and Christianity are making right here are. And it's also worth noting that, again, Jesus has been training disciples, people willing to follow him on this. They're not there. None of these disciples can handle this moment, but there's this almost offhanded comment about these women who were culturally lesser, who were not as important as the men. They were not even really human beings in this patriarchal culture in which they lived. And yet they are the ones who have the courage. They are there watching this difficult moment occur, and they are going to be the ones that show up again at the moment of the resurrection. In chapter 16, we read, "When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on, the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, 'Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?' They were looking up, and they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting at the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, 'Don't be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you'll see him, just as he told you.' They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." So, kind of an interesting, just historical textual note is many of our modern Bibles will continue the story from there with Jesus actually seeing Mary Magdalene and appearing to disciples, right? But you'll also see a note in most modern Bibles saying the earliest and best resources don't have these endings. And as far as we can tell, Mark actually ended right where I stopped. It leaves on this incredible cliffhanger where nobody has yet seen the resurrected Jesus. And so, yes, it is disputed whether there's a piece that was lost, whether one of these other endings that seem to have been added later are one of the originals. But I think it was probably meant to leave on this cliffhanger. And here is why I think that that's effective and important. It focuses our attention on a very specific point, and that is these words that he has risen, right? He has been vindicated by God. He has proven himself more powerful. And where the other gospels are going to go on and explain some of the appearances and why that's important and the commissioning of the disciples or whatever, very important things for us to know. But again, that's why we have multiple gospels. Mark has brought us to this point. He's been warning us about this coming. And kind of like a modern movie, right, where you get that big twist ending where you there's all the pieces and you're not sure what's going on, and then you get the big revelation, right? And then sometimes they'll even give you like the flashbacks where you go back through and say, "Oh, this led to this, and this was, and that comment here, that actually meant this," right? And then the whole thing kind of clicks into place and you understand the ending. The Gospel of Mark, I think, is doing that exact same thing. Does it feel like we're left on a total cliffhanger with them in the dark, wondering what's going on, wondering that it's true? Sure, narratively. But those words have such important punch in this gospel. He has risen. And if that is true, that means we need to reconsider everything he's set up to this point. He refused to defend himself in his trial because he trusted that God was going to prove him right. God was going to vindicate him even beyond this moment of breakage and loneliness, right? He warned his disciples what it was like to follow him. You can go back through the gospel, and the words he has risen prove everything that he is saying was true. The ways he heals people, the ways he talks about God, the way he prioritizes. And I think that's exactly what it is meant to do. So on Sunday, we're actually going to look at just some random highlights of mine, because I think that question is one that we as disciples need to wrestle with more often than we do, that the modern church still needs to wrestle with. Is this true? Do we live in such a way that Jesus Christ is risen? He was proved right in, again, the people he spent time with, the way he talked about God, the healing and the wholeness he was constantly bringing into the world. Because, like it or not, we still kind of tend to act like life is normal and God's out there somewhere. And yes, he wants us to behave in certain ways. He wants the world to look in a certain place. But we have this bad habit of thinking it's up to ourselves and that we need to just survive in the world as it is. We're just making do in so many ways, right? And I think this revelation, he is risen. He is right in the ways he talked about God. He is right in the ways he talked about the kingdom of God among us. He is inviting us into a completely different world that we simply do not take that seriously most of the time. My hope, and I think the way the gospel is written, is that this will force us back into the Gospel of Mark to look at some of the crazy things that Jesus is constantly saying about God and the world. If he was proved right, if he is risen, if he is vindicated in the end that this is what is true, and all those other ways of being in the world are not true, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for the world? And are we living in such a way that this is true, or do we just kind of vaguely understand? Are we continuing to stumble into the dark that God is alive, that God is active, and all those things that Jesus said are in fact true and proven true by this resurrection? So I think that's the beautiful thing we get to wrestle with. On Sunday, I'm going to provide just some kind of random wild quotes, like I was just talking about, from the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to sit with those and look at these. And I would encourage all of us this week to go back through, read some pieces of the Gospel that baffle us or excite us, and recognize this is the true story, not the kind of depressing and half the ho-hum, the one where we have to make do one we are so often provided from, by the world. This is what real life is, and we have to be realistic. He is risen claims something very different. Do we live in the way that God is risen and alive and knows the best life? Or are we living another version in which we try to pay attention every now and then? I think that's the question the gospel is meant to leave us with, and one that I think we all need to chew on a little.